Let us get started. We are at long last in the home stretch on aggression and antidotes to aggression. And where we were near the end of was the evolution of aggression. And what we saw was all sorts of totally reasonable ways in which the principles of individual selection will push one towards aggression, heavily in the realm of male-male competition. We then looked at the realms of kin selection and its relevance to that. Far more importantly, we looked at the realms of pseudo-kinship and pseudo-speciation and that role in playing an enormous motivating factor in lots of conflicts. Now, what we've touched on here before moving to the evolution of non-aggression, evolution of aggression, wonderful work, insightful work by someone named Susan Fiske at Princeton over the course of her career, focusing on this whole notion that we've got more than one category of thems in our head. We have multiple types reflecting fairly different evolutionary pressures. We have multiple types. And what she famously has done is map this out into two axes here. What we have here is assessing how warm some other group is, whether they have low warmth, friendliness, I don't know, involvement, assimilation, or high in warmth. And then one axis of how competent these people are, high versus low. And just to start off, there's the wonderful corner here of people who we view as being very competent and very warm and altruistic and empathic. Us, of course. Us, of course. And that is the marker of every in-group that they would place themselves in that box. And the us's there is mostly about, I don't know, all sorts of aspects of brain development. Very interestingly, then, we move to this category. Individuals viewed as high in warmth, but low in competence. Who are we talking about here? Infants, demented individuals, things of that sort. What do they evoke? They evoke pity. They evoke a sense of protectiveness. They activate the anterior cingulate. And in some ways, these are people who are still honorary us's. These are people who used to be an us, or will be an us, or would have been an us if this mutation hadn't happened, or things of that sort. That's a domain where honorary us's, where what is evoked is pity and a desire to protect them. Now, in this category, we have the individuals we view as being both low in competence, low in warmth. What do they evoke in us? Disgust. And Fiske doing all sorts of brain imaging studies showing who are the sorts of people, faces that evoke this. Junkies, homeless people, people of that sort. And what's activating here, you should be able to get the correct answer to this in your sleep. Insular cortex. Insular cortex then activating the amygdala. So people who are viewed as barely worth noting beyond how unappealing they are, low competence, low warmth, disgust. Now we get to the most interesting category, which are individuals who were viewed as high competence but low warmth. Who are they? And these are the people throughout history in all sorts of societies, a number of them all over the planet, people who are the outgroup who were viewed as they're not one of us, they don't assimilate, they're not warm, they're not friendly, they're clannish, things like that. But damn, they're good at business and make a lot of money. Or damn, you may not like them, but if you get sick, better go find one of them who's a doctor because they make the best doctors and things of that sort. This combination of dislike but having to admit to the competence. And what does this generate? Hatred, envy, resentment, all of that. And culture after culture does this. This is the Jews of Europe for many centuries. These are the Indo-Pakistanis of East Africa who, because of colonial practices, couldn't own land, couldn't join the colonial service, and thus became the shopkeepers, and thus became wealthy, middle class, and resented like crazy by Black East African people there. And every time there is political instability in, say, Kenya, for example, I was there years ago during a coup attempt, and as soon all the military fighting was done with, everybody ransacks all the stores of the Indo-Pakistanis. Every mob attacks them, gang violence, gang rapes, things of that sort. All of these as those folks who don't really want to be one of us, who can never be one of us, but damn, they are good at making money. In West Africa, Lebanese serve this role. In Malaysia, Chinese serve this role. This is a classic one. And this pops up over and over. And what are you activating there? The amygdala overwhelmingly. And what we see here is one of the most interesting, one of the most appalling things that people do with our categories of them, which is when you finally come after these folks, when it's time for them to pay what's coming to them, or when you finally do that, one of the very strong cultural responses is, in the process, try to degrade them, try to humiliate them, turn them into this category. And that was the Nazis making Jews with toothbrushes scrubbing the sidewalks and the curbs and the roadsides while crowds sort of stood there and mocked them. In East Africa, when Idi Amin in Uganda in the mid-70s took away the citizenship of approximately 80,000 Indo-Pakistanis and told them they had a few days to leave the country, he invited his troops and the general populace to loot and beat and rape and degrade, all these versions of one of the most hateful things that is done when showing us them dichotomizing is when you finally act on the resentment, when you finally act on the envy, to not only remove their power, but degrade them into being this category. And we're going to look at some of the implications of that. Okay, so we don't just have one kind of them, and we have dramatically different responses depending on which category they are in. Ones who might eventually be here, ones who are not going anywhere, ones who, if we get it together enough, we can move into that category, those sorts of quadrants there. Now, getting back to the whole issue of sacred values, sacred symbols, and how much peace can be brought about when one group recognizes another, and like settling up financial claims is how you end war, recognizing each other's sacred symbols is how you make lasting peace, all of that. One of the things that's done in here as well, in trying to move this group into this group, is to very intentionally violate, desecrate their sacred symbols. One example of that, the 15th century, when the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, easternmost edge of sort of Eastern Christianity, conquered Constantinople after a pretty protracted war there. And what did they do shortly after that? They took the main church in Constantinople, Christian Constantinople, and turned it into a horse paddock, turned it into where they leave their horses to crap all over the floor. What could have been a clearer symbol of, ye people now are not only low warmth, but look at what we can do to your holy sites. Another example of that was seen in the year 2000 when the Israeli general Ariel Sharon decided to show off his manhood by surrounding himself by a couple of hundred police and army guys and went and broke every single sort of faux pas possible in terms of relations with Muslims that he went to a Muslim holy site, the Temple Mount. He went there and said, no one's going to stop me, even though that was not allowed, even though that was desecrating the central tenet there. And what was he showing them? Not only do we think you're low warmth, and not only do we sort of have some ambivalent feelings about this, but you have no efficacy. You have no control in these realms, and we're just going to get a bunch of soldiers. And if I feel like going to your third most sacred place in all of Islam and stand there for a photo op, let's just see you stop me. So, circumstances of different categories, ways in which we can move them around, or ways in which we would hope to or recognize we might have, and all. And one of the key things going in this transition, turning thems into these folks, is violating their sacred symbols. That is extremely effective. Okay, so this brings us now, when looking at this, all these great reasons why aggression should be selected for. We've got individual selection motivations, kin selection, pseudo-kinship, all of that. And throughout all the years by which sort of evolutionary thinking about behavior was dominated by aggression and the rewards of aggression and the rewards of stratification and the rewards of male dominance, and how natural it is that evolution has produced that in oh so many species. Throughout, there was always a view that you think in an evolutionary framework, and there's a loads of reasons why you were selecting for non-aggression. You were selecting for counters to aggression, alternatives to aggression, selecting for means to turn aggression into something very different from that. So, as much evolutionary evidence for that as for this is a world in which it's like male-male competition until the cows come home, the evolution of non-aggression. So starting off with that, you would think right off the bat at our first sort of foundation of individual selection. Individual selection, you're trying to maximize as many number of copies of your genes in the next generation as possible. What did we hear before? That's a driving force between male violence directed at females who were non-reciprocating, all that sort of thing. What have we also been hearing about over the weeks? Alternative strategies available to males. And we've heard one already, which is back with the baboons, that whole business of like female choice. The fact that if a female doesn't want to be stuck with this high-ranking lug when she's ovulating, there's all sorts of female means of increasing the tension between that individual and somebody else. And what does the female then do? She runs off to the proverbial bushes with the nice guy who she has an affiliative relationship with. And that, of course, raises all sorts of, oh, maybe nice guys don't finish last, but okay, so they run off to the bushes and do that. It's not like there's a whole lot of that. Genetic studies suggest that this alternative strategy, this strategy of being a nice guy, male baboon, is a very viable means of passing on copies of your genes. So, alternative strategies there. Kinship. Where does kinship come in terms of decreasing aggression? A wonderful example of this. This is seen in two different ways. This is apparently a motif that is found among a number of Australian indigenous groups. And this is thought to be symbolic of something culturally that is done. Okay, you're out in the desert, you're wandering around, there's a water hole once every 10 miles or so, and you're coming up on one, and if you don't get water from this, you're not going to last till the next one. It is essential that you get there, and as you're approaching it, oh no, you see a stranger approaching from the opposite side, just as intent on getting water. And you've got this problem here. If I don't know this person and they're a stranger, they may try to kill me, so I should probably kill them first. And all the ways in which we are hurtled into the logic of violence there. And what has evolved instead is the two individuals sit down and each of them starts saying, I am whoever, I'm the son of whoever, I'm the grandson of whoever, going through while the other person then does the same. And on and on, there's a very finite number of names, or so. At some point, they stumble onto the same name. And what they're able to do then is say, oh, you're a relative. You're a relative. You're a 400th cousin of mine. You're a relative. Sorry, I didn't recognize you. Here's how we can now both peacefully get some water here and walk away thinking that we're not going to be stabbed in the back afterward. Totally artificial mechanism to generate a kin selective solution to you and that scary armed stranger, both at the water hole. The same exact thing is done in the Middle East with Bedouin tribes, with Bedouin clans, that at various points they come up with treaties, clans that have been fighting in some culture of honor matter. And what is done ritualistically is the old guys from each group get together and sit down and they figure out a way in which the history of their clan, they made a mistake. They left out a name. They left out the name of one of their ancestors while they discovered this. And whoa, we are actually sibling clans. We are not enemy clans. We're actually related to each other. Nobody falls for it. Nonetheless, symbolically, this is pulling in the power of kin selection and pseudo kinship for decreasing aggression. Now, the pseudo kinship stuff is obviously great for all sorts of realms of decreasing violence and that sort of thing. Great example after the French Revolution. Not only was everyone like calling each other brother and sister, there's the informal sense in the you, vous, or two, or vous, or something. There's the informal grammatical form that you use for family members, and then there's the formal one you use for others. A great example of that when Leo Tolstoy was a child, growing up in great privilege, being Russian aristocracy at the time. What he, of course, was taught was French, and his nanny was French. And one time he ran to his parents in hysteria. He was about 5 years old, that the nanny had had the audacity to address him with the informal tense rather than the formal my lord sort of thing. So you see that contrast there. In the aftermath of the French Revolution, there was a period where everybody had to use the informal family grammar there. Everybody is a brother and a sister. So all of that is good news, but we've already seen something disappointing, which is our contact theory. Wow, you could turn thems into us's, and soon you're using informal French verbs or whatever. If you only have contact, we saw the limitations of that. It's got to be equal numbers on equal ground, without any sort of sacred symbols of each side that would be viewed as provocative. You have to have a shared goal that takes some work to make people work as a team. And all of that done, what you see is coming out the other end is no lasting changes in attitudes, no peace leader that has ever emerged from one of those summer camps, that sort of thing. Nonetheless, sometimes contact works. And when it seems to do its best, the studies show is the largest decreases in prejudice against an outgroup over the course of time is mostly happening when you're sharing positions in a workforce, when it's a peer in a workforce. Why is that? It's a shared goal. There's not a big deal being made out of the symbolism of the two of you sitting there interacting with each other. Oh, look how great this is. You're just going about your jobs together. You're doing it for extended periods of time. And that is found to be a scenario where you have a fairly dramatic decrease in outgrouping the thems. That's a version of contact theory that works. And ironically, insofar as we're talking here about non-aggression, it turned out one of the best domains for that was in-groups and out-groups dealing with each other in the military. This was something recognized with the sort of wave of civil rights movement and desegregation and such, that to some degree the military had already shown that one version of contact theory there can cause substantial decreases in out-group animosity. Okay, obviously, the next thing that just gives us hope for the planet from an evolutionary standpoint is reciprocal altruism. Even if you're individually selfish and selfish with you and your two brothers and eight cousins, all of that reciprocal altruism from the very start of this course was a means of getting cooperation, a means of, in this case, decreasing aggression. Now, the basic problem with reciprocal altruism for trying to make the world better was summarized by this guy in the 60s named Garrett Hardin, who wrote a very influential book and in the process introduced a very influential concept to us, the tragedy of the commons. And what he drew upon was historically, I don't know, Victorian England, medieval England, whatever, there would be a commons in a village, a big open field of grass that was open to everyone, of common use. And everybody could come and bring their sheep there to graze. And Hardin's point was this generates the tragedy of the commons, which is every person, amid wanting the commons to continue, has a personal investment in cheating and having their sheep eat more than their share. And if everybody did that, the whole thing would fall apart and there'd be chaos and skinny sheep and things of that sort. And this was the dangerous shared resource where there's no individual incentive to not take more than your share. And Hardin became very famous for this being an extremely pessimistic view, and he was heavily embraced by the slowly emerging ecology and environmentalism movements of saying the planet is a commons and we are barreling towards a tragedy of the commons by those of us who are getting a disproportionate share of energy and clean water and all that sort of thing. But amid that, something that was not paid a whole lot of attention to is that historically the commons worked. The commons worked throughout history of common resources like that. When everyone in the village had access to the same common source, you would not get things breaking down. Instead, the commons worked rather than being tragically dysfunctional. And what this brings us to, of course, is the fact that there are payoffs with stable cooperation. We saw that back in the very beginning, that first round robin tournament run by Axelrod, computerizing people's different prisoner's dilemma strategies. And the one that wound up defeating all the others, tit for tat, was one whose starting point was benevolent, starting point was cooperative, was capable of detecting if it was cheated against, was capable of being punitive in response, but the response, the retribution was proportional, and there was a mechanism for it being solved, for forgiveness, for things being reestablished again with cooperation. What we see with all of these is that reciprocal altruism and the emergence has on a certain level been the ways by which you solve tragedy of the commons. So what we started off with back then is why, if there's a known number of rounds, if it's one round, it never makes sense to cooperate, because if the other person stabs you in the back, you will always be one step behind at the end of your one round game. And we saw the logic that whatever number of rounds it is, there's the same logic. If you know how many rounds there are, there's the same logic to not cooperate in the very last round. And thus, insofar as that was already decided, it doesn't make any sense to cooperate in the next to last round, and the next to last round, and going all, why any number of rounds, as long as you know what that number is, collapses cooperation. What we saw was what fosters cooperation is as soon as you put in an unknown number of rounds, because there's always the possibility of the other individual being able to take revenge. The term given in the field is that as soon as you have an unknown number of rounds, you've just invented the shadow of the future. The possibility that there is going to be a future that will make any action you take right now potentially not to have been worth it when you were looking back on everything. As soon as you put in an unknown number of rounds, you begin selecting for cooperation. So we saw that. What we then begin to see are elaborations on this. Unknown number of rounds, and you have what's called open book play. You're coming and playing against this individual, and it's an open book as to what you did in your previous games with other individuals. You can come with a reputation. And as soon as that comes in, that you could find out, was this person a creep in previous games? So don't give him an inch, don't give him the benefit of the doubt. What do we have here? What is open book enforcement of reciprocal altruism? That's what gossip is doing. That's what gossip is doing in traditional societies, where it's a means by which you get consensus for norm violators once it is possible that the next person you are going to play against knows just what you've been doing in the past. That selects for cooperation. Added to it, an even stronger tendency that we see here is unknown number of rounds, open book play, and your opponent, other players, have the option to opt out, to shun you, to ostracize you, to refuse to interact with you. And if the sort of cooperativity going in something like this is a payoff for everyone, this is a tremendous cost as soon as people have the option to not play with you. And that's the biggest way you can have an adverse consequence for being a jerk with open book play, your reputation being so bad that you are excluded from it. And a version of that is seen in all sorts of hunter-gatherer societies where they spend tons of time gossiping around the fire at night, figuring out who needs to be sort of dealt with. And what he noted was a hierarchy that is found amongst most hunter-gatherers. What you do with a norm violator, and you sort of talk to them, or you like take away some privilege of theirs, or some such thing. You don't treat them reciprocally, something like that. But in all of these cultures, the extreme thing that winds up being done is the person is tossed out. The person is put out on their own. The person is shunned. And in places like that, that is basically a death sentence. And what is seen at the most extreme version of shunning someone, taking them out of the picture, is in most indigenous hunter-gatherer cultures, there is murder. There is murder, and it is almost always group consensus. Everybody gets together and decides this person is beyond the pale, and if and only if there's something resembling consensus, that's when you see individual violence in hunter-gatherers, along with male-male competition. So, as soon as you have the option of opting out and not playing with someone, or opting them out if they're being a jerk, you strongly pull for cooperation. Then, next studies began to explore a piece of reality, which is we're all in different sort of games, multiple games simultaneously, games, scenarios where there's the option to cooperate, the option to compete in between, and you have to decide what your strategy is going to be. Life is full of us participating in multiple games. Do you stop for the pedestrian? Can anyone see that you were jerking? You drove through the crosswalk. Things like that, all the way up to the most obviously clear examples where you have to choose whether to cooperate or cheat. And what you see is, insofar as people are simultaneously in multiple games, if you hook up two players and you're playing in a particular game that has a certain barrier, a certain degree of inertia for establishing cooperation, if they're simultaneously in a game alongside, if they alternate rounds between game one and game two, and game two happens to be one whose setup is, it is very, very favorable for cooperation to emerge. As soon as it's established here, you see crosstalk. You can get bleeding from a cooperative relationship coming into this. And what studies have shown is under what circumstances is it easier for the cooperation to bleed into and influence the non-cooperation? In what circumstances does it go the other way? But the fact that multiple games are going on for any given person, that gives all sorts of possibilities. Where things really start to move in the direction of cooperation is as soon as you introduce the possibility of punishment. Punishment for antisocial play. Punishment for somebody stabbing you in the back, and tit for tat being our most basic fruit fly of introducing punishment into reciprocal altruistic relationships. There's a problem, though, with introducing punishment into the scene. And this is something that plagues every aspect of reform of the criminal justice system or things of that sort. The fact that we like to punish. We like to punish righteously. People will pay for the opportunity to do so. Most informally, when you stick somebody in a brain scanner, the chance to righteously punish someone causes the dopamine system to go crazy. We like punishment for its own sake. On some level, retribution, justice being done in our minds, in our limbic systems, is a virtue in and of itself. So any assessment of what introducing punishment into this whole realm of strategizing, you got to keep in mind that a lot of the time there is a pull for punishment for its own sake. Okay, so punishment. First version, simplest version, is the person who you have just stabbed in the back has the option of punishing you back in return. And most games that introduce this have some element where in the aftermath, the victim is willing to give up X amount of their resources in exchange for the jerk losing 2X amount of resources. They are willing to pay to punish the other individual. Or you can even see a formal version of what would count as spite. You're willing to pay 2x of your resources just to get them punished 1x. You're willing to pay more just to get them punished in some way whatsoever, even to a lesser extent. As soon as you introduce the possibility of victims punishing, and punishing of a magnitude more than the cheating got you in the first place, cooperation comes through like crazy. That immediately selects for it. Where you really get powerful reining and effects of punishment in terms of maintaining cooperation is when you introduce what is called third-party punishment. You're a chimp, and you're seeing some other chimp being a jerk to that chimp, and you intervene in their defense. That is third-party punishment. An objective, disinterested outsider who has a veil of ignorance as to who's done what, but nonetheless sees somebody being victimized and steps in. As soon as you have third-party punishers, that really powerfully selects for cooperation. Why is that so? Because what third-party punishment does is it moves this whole world of are you nice or not nice to people, all of that, outside the realm of dyadic relations, just between the two of you. Whoa, look at that. Just between the two of you, and by bringing in a third party, what you have done symbolically is you bring in everybody else and their potential judgments. Third-party punishment is a way, in effect, building on open book play for everyone to collectively decide that punishment is needed. Okay, note though that in third-party punishment, in any of these, it is coming with a cost. This individual is willing to give up 1x of their resources to have the jerk lose 2x. That would be third-party punishment when they were not the victim. They're willing to pay their own stuff in order to get third-party punishment is costly. What is the motivation for it? And in some circumstances, the third-party punishment collapses. In a number of cultures, what looks like third-party punishment then falls apart because when the third-party one sort of punishes the jerk, they take their possessions. So this is not really like a disinterested one. And various anthropologists have noted this pattern. But third-party overall What is the payoff for it? And the payoff is shown to be trust. In open book play, if somebody comes in and not only are they known to have been an honest player, but when information, reputational information is given that they have been a third party punisher, they are trusted even more. Being a disinterested bystander who then steps in is, in effect, an amazing way of generating social capital in your social system. Is generating trust. Another way of stating this is, like in some cases, third-party punishment. It doesn't necessarily have to come in the form of trust. You can get paid to be a third-party punisher. That's what police are. That's what society as a whole does in pooling resources to make it worth the while of somebody to act as a third party agent. And, police, that's what they are. And we pay for their salaries. We pay for their, like, dental insurance, things of that sort. That's another way embedded in the trust is to get an external source of payment. Okay, so none of this makes sense if none of you are ever going to encounter the jerk after that. What we also have as a motivation for third-party punishment is pay it forward realms. You know that you are likely to interact with this individual somewhere down the line because there's 25 of you in this band. And by investing in third-party punishment here, if you make it more likely that they're not going to do it when they face you, that's another motivation. Okay, so third-party punishment, pay it forward strategies where you earn recognition, you earn reputation or trust, all of that. So we have another problem here, though, which is naturally as soon as we have third-party stuff coming into there, we have the possibility of third-party cheaters. And what do we have here? This is a realm of corrupt cops. This is a realm of when they wound up having to choose between doing their role or something selfish. And what do you thus have? You have circumstances where this individual has done something crummy to that one, and you have a third party punisher, and there's the possibility for them to cheat. What do you have to have there? The possibility of punishment of them. What's that? That's police review boards. That's police review boards looking at citizen complaints about police brutality and things of that sort, of us assessing whether this person is doing a competent job. What we're beginning to get to here is something that is familiar with honor codes in all sorts of places, like West Point Military Academy, which is you could get punished for cheating. Okay, so that puts you into that realm. You could get punished for knowing that somebody else cheated and not turning them in. In other words, you potentially being an effective third-party punisher by going and telling the authorities about the person, and instead you have cheated by the rules of that honor code, and thus you need to be enforced in your third-party role, punishing for not turning in somebody else. And what you begin to see here is every one of these steps, as you add them in, makes for more cooperation and makes for eventually, with enough layers of this, what you're defining is society in circles of people keeping track of each other, pushing for some sort of cooperation there. Okay, so all sorts of good stuff could come out of this. And we see in this context just how crazily counterintuitive and bizarre all those people in ex-Soviet bloc countries doing that pathological, this sort of non-altruistic punishment where you're punishing somebody for being too generous, because if they do that, everybody's going to start expecting you to be generous, and and let's nip that one in the bud and punish them for being overly cooperative. You could see in the context of all of this just how unprecedented, just how pathological that winds up being. Okay, so what this begins to introduce, once you're doing things like getting cooperation more easily selected for, what we now take that to is a larger level. And when you turn uncooperative people into being cooperative, which defined by your own self-interest, the interest of you and your in-group, is mechanisms by which you turn thems into us's. And that happens all the time. In the face of the fact that we clearly are very, very hardwired for us-them dichotomizing. 10-month-old kids already do it, as we've heard. You look at a face of an other, and the dichotomized response to that is occurring in under a tenth of a second, and it is really hard to condition it out. As we saw also, throw oxytocin in there, and the fact that our brains are divided into us's and thems, and that oxytocin enhances prosociality amid the us's, but makes you crummier to the thems, showing we have a very, very fundamental split in our heads in terms of us-them dichotomizing. So, how do you overcome that? How do you ever turn thems into us's? And this takes us now to this factoid we've been hearing at various points throughout the course. Put somebody in a brain scanner, they're white, flash up faces in front of them, flash up the face of someone who is black, and in about 75% of the people in the brain scanners, you get activation of the amygdala. Maybe not activation for 8 hours afterward, maybe activation for 1 second before the frontal cortex kicks in and says, don't think that, that's not who I am, whatever, but about 75%. That number keeps coming up, and that's roughly the number that appears in there, depending on what kind of picture, who's in that picture, what face, what gender, what age, what facial expression, but nonetheless averaging out to about 75%. So what this finally brings us to is, who are the 25%? What are the predictors of people who do not have an automatic implicit amygdala responding to thems within a fraction of a second? Who's the 25%? And what you find in those studies is it tends to be people who grew up in multiracial neighborhoods, not ones that were de facto segregated in terms of social interactions, but grew up in a setting where multiracial interactions were the norm. Second predictor, that you at some point had a close, intimate relationship with somebody of that other group. Those are the predictors. So what we're saying here is those sorts of interventions, what they're doing is making thems not really count as thems anymore, moving them out of a them category into being an us or an honorary us or some version of that. One of the effective means there, when you see, look at the 25%, is experience in life has made them not to have that as a particularly relevant dichotomy between an us and them. That's not one that's important to them. All sorts of manipulations can be done, though, to change us-them categorizing over the course of just a few minutes, not over the course of your lifetime, because we can't go back and decide we want to grow up in a different neighborhood. And this is back to this work by Fisk and her colleagues at Princeton, showing what things can you do in the minutes before you stick somebody in the brain scanner, you're flashing up faces, what sort of psychological manipulations, instructions, things of that sort can you do to blunt the response of the amygdala? We already heard many weeks back a way to make the amygdaloid response even more extreme and play stereotypical music that you don't like associated with that output, whatever. We heard that one. What could be done? What subliminal stuff? What instructions? What some stuff going on in the minutes before can you do to undo this amygdaloid response? The easiest one tells us nothing at all. In this version, what would Fisk do? Fisk would say, okay, we're going to flash up a bunch of pictures, and if there's a red dot in the middle of the picture, if you can spot it before we take the picture away, you get 1 brownie point. The person has an incentive to be looking for this thing that has nothing to do with the faces. What do you see then? There's no amygdala response. No wonder they're not processing the faces as faces. When they're seeing the face of an us, the fusiform is not activating. When you're seeing the face of a them, the amygdala is not, because all they're doing is looking for this little dot. Okay, hooray, we can solve amygdalas activating in response to thems by making faces irrelevant and just have us look for like how many nose hairs somebody has, and that's the only relevant thing. So that's great, but doesn't get us very far. Another option is to move the person, the them, into a different category that you share with them in a completely neutral, arbitrary way. And this is shown, I think we've already discussed this. I think I've already talked about this. Um, these are studies where you look at a film clip of a bunch of people playing basketball, and half the players are white and half are black, and like split up between the teams, and there's all sorts of action going on. And afterward, you ask the subject, okay, which person was it who blocked that shot? Which person was it who did that amazing three-pointer? And what you see is if somebody gets the wrong answer, if they pick the wrong person, they are way more likely than chance to pick somebody of the same race as the person who actually did that. Oh, they've got an automatic category in their head of race in there. Automatic one, so that insofar as you are turning thems into undifferentiated thems, if you're going to make a mistake and pick the wrong person, it's going to be someone of the same salient category. Now, do the experiment a little bit differently, and now it's a film clip where everyone is wearing a red shirt or a blue shirt, and two different teams, and each team is racially balanced, all of that. And now the game goes along the same stuff, and you ask somebody the same kind of questions. Who was it who did that amazing between the leg dribble or whatever? And if they identify the wrong person, it's more likely than chance for it to be somebody of the same shirt color. In other words, what you've done with that, with putting in another dichotomy that is screamingly apparent, some of them have red shirts, some of them have blue shirts, you have subordinated race as a dichotomized category, as a meaningful category. You've subordinated it to this completely neutral one. Ooh, what color shirt is it? That kind of thing. And that color shirt is a means of also appreciating how shallow race as a categorization is. Do the same thing with people, players of different sexes, and you continue to categorize by sex regardless of the shirt color. That's a more salient category. Why does that make sense? I think we've discussed this already. Why does this make sense? How long have humans been paying attention to the sex of other individuals? How long has sex been around? And this, I don't know, 150 million years or so. That has been a salient category to us for a long, long time. Best estimates are that racial differences only evolved in the last 30, 40,000 years or so. So that's a blink of an eye. That is a very recent addition to the human psyche. And for 99.9% of that time, your average person never met anybody from a different race because you're a hunter-gatherer in this corner of the planet, and you'll maybe travel 20 miles from your home over the course of your entire lifetime, and the nearest person of a different race is 5,000 miles away. Race is not a particularly fundamental category, and this dovetails with all the findings that race, from an evolutionary standpoint, from a genetic standpoint, from a biological standpoint, is a statistical construct. And it is easily supplanted by what color shirt someone is wearing. And now you can break down that particular us theming and get an amygdala that's not going to respond by putting the individuals into a different category that's really, really salient to you, that really matters to you. Whether the person's in a red shirt or a blue shirt, that's arbitrary or whatever, but instead put them into a different category where that categorical boundary really matters to you. Now, relevant to this, I was doing some reading recently and discovered San Francisco has a baseball team. I had to look that up, and they're called the Giants. So they play baseball, and there's people in San Francisco who like the Giants, and the Giants have a mortal enemy team, and I can't remember which it is, but people who are Giants fans loathe the other team, and so now you're flashing up pictures of faces, and you've managed to catch one of these San Francisco sort of obsessive baseball Giants fans and stuck them in a brain scanner, and you're flashing up faces, and some of them are the same skin color as the person in there, and some of it, but each one is wearing a baseball cap, either with a Giants logo or a logo of the dreaded, and skin color doesn't begin to have any effect on the amygdala response. In a fraction of a second, the amygdala has switched to what's the most important us, them in the universe, us Giants fans versus anyone else. And that's like you see two people as different as possible sitting next to each other in a stadium chanting the same stupid chant for their team or something. And that is the only, that's somebody you would live for and die for and kill for, all of that because they're your blood brother, because you both know how to sing this ridiculous team song or something. That completely supplants race as a relevant category. So you can do that. But then the most interesting thing is the final experiment that Fiske did was something where you would sit the person down before saying, we're going to put you in the scanner and like we're going to show you a bunch of faces and tell you what, for each face, tell me if you think that's somebody who would like to eat broccoli. Some completely random, arbitrary food, a food without any particular cultural sort of connotations or something. So here, look at each face and tell me if you think that's somebody who is going to like broccoli. So you stick the person in the scanner and they're going through, and what you see is the amygdala is much less responsive. It may not respond at all. That is blunting it. Why? Because you've been given an instruction to individuate that person, to look at their face and imagine them sitting down to dinner and taking a bite of whatever. And do they love it or is not something they particularly like? You imagine them in the aisles of the supermarket shop. You imagine them as an individual rather than them as an arbitrary member of this outgroup category. And that's an incredibly powerful way of undoing it. So, there are all sorts of ways in which you can undo variations of us-theming, recategorizing in a more relevant sort of kind of way, individuating the person in a powerful way. And these things can work. Two interesting historical examples of this, showing the extent to which they can work and where they still don't work completely. One of them was this guy, John Newton. John Newton in the late 18th century, early 19th, he was one of the leading British theologians and abolitionists. And he played a key role in 1803 when the British Empire banned slavery or transports of slaves. They didn't free people already slaves until sometime after that, but he played a key role in that giant figure, theologian, religious sort of rationale for why we've got to stop the slave trade and like somebody of massive good. As a young man, John Newton was the captain of a slave ship. He spent quite a length of time ferrying captured slaves from West Africa to various points in the New World, and this is how he made his living. At one point, he was captured by pirates, and he was kept as a slave in what's probably now Mauritania for a number of months before he was liberated. Okay, here's the change that's going to come with him. He now has experienced life as a slave. He knows what an empathy and what they're going through and all of that. So what does he do? He goes back to being the captain of a slave ship. Has no effect on him. Later point, there's some massive storm, and the ship's about to sink, and he prays to God saying, if you save me, I will transform my life. and the storm stops. And this is transformation that he says, I can't be a slaver anymore. I have to like work for Nah, that's not what he does. At this point, he decides that God has told him it's time to stop being a slaver. And besides, he's getting on the old side, and that takes a lot of work and stuff. So he goes to theological school in England. And while training to be clergy, he's investing in the slave trade. Can you believe this guy? He's going on like this, and none of those made a recategorization in him. And somewhere, when he was decades and decades past, finally having nothing to do with the slave trade, something shifted in him, something changed, and he became this leading abolitionist who had an enormous moral authority because he was willing to say, I used to make a living as a slaver. Enormous impact, all of that. And he celebrated his moral transformation there by writing a hymn that all of us have heard of. This is the composer, author of Amazing Grace. So that's wonderful and so moving, but nonetheless, there was a period when he had just sort of graduated from clergy school where he was an amazing humanitarian in London and taking care of the needs of the poor while still investing in the slave trade, moving categories around, and some people counted as being worthy of your protection and being beneficent to the poor, and he was renowned for it, while the whole time maintaining a category so strong there that he could continue to become rich from the slave trade. So, changing isn't uniform across these categories. Another example of this, incredibly moving story. This was late 1960s, 70s or so, Pearl Harbor Day. What's that, December 6th, 7th, whatever it is, commemorating the day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and sunk a whole bunch of ships and killed like 3,000 sailors and civilians. And every year there's Pearl Harbor Day commemorating that. And every year there's the ceremony on the island of, which island is it? It's the island where the attack was made, where Pearl Harbor is, and decreasing numbers of soldiers, sailors who were there and survived it now as old men, coming to this ceremony each year to commemorate what happened. And one of these years, as these aging survivors of this were standing there and singing Amazing Grace or who knows what, suddenly from out of the crowd came a very elderly Japanese man who came up to them, and in halting English, he apologized for what he had done on Pearl Harbor Day. The man, named Zenji Abe, had been one of the lead fighter pilots in the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was as militaristic as you could get. He was in the military academy in Japan, in Imperial Japan, starting at age 5. He had spent his whole life in this, and he was thrilled to be leading the attack. And now, 50 years later, whatever year it was, many decades later, he was now this old man coming to apologize and begging their forgiveness. And some of the survivors there had nothing to do with him, but one man embraced him and they became very close and eventually visited each other's families. And when one of them died, the other wrote a letter to the grandkids about how what a wonderful man Grandpa was. And this was someone who had been dropping bombs, connecting with someone who had been on the ground, getting injured in the process, with friends getting killed left and right. And this is what they did decades later. Oh, great. This is so wonderful, this recategorization. So the first question about Zenji Abe is, where'd this come from? How'd this guy do this? And there were some interesting things in his past. Towards the end of the war, he was captured, and he wound up as a POW of the Americans rather than the Soviets, for example, and he was very well treated, and he kind of appreciated that. Going back to Japan, he got a job in some corporation, which at some point was bought by an American multinational, and he worked for an American company, and they were like kind of nice bosses. And he kind of discovered he liked Americans. One of his kids married somebody American and moved to the United States. So all sorts of things chipping away at turning Americans from thems into us's enough for him to want to apologize. The final piece of it was the pilots in Pearl Harbor were told that Japan had declared war on the United States that morning. That was not the case. Pearl Harbor was a sneak attack. And when he found this out, this was shameful to him. You sneak up. No, you don't sneak up on the enemy. You say, we are at war, and I honor you enough to tell you that you are now my enemy, and this was a shameful thing to have happened. So all those pieces put together help explain how this man did this incredibly dramatic change in us-theming many years later. So, what's the problem there with that? Just as we saw with John Newton, being wonderful, the poor of London, while still being perfectly fine with there being slavery, a similar thing with Zenji Abe. Some years before Pearl Harbor, he had been part of the Japanese military that had invaded Manchuria, invaded China, and people who know the history of that, the rape of Nanjing, one of the most brutal, atrocity-filled conquests in all of history. The Japanese were unspeakably brutal to the Chinese, who they had under their control and stuff. And during that period, Zenji Abe was in the Air Force, and he took part in it. And there's no evidence that he ever went to anyone in China and apologized for his role in that. What's the difference? I don't know. His kid married somebody. Maybe that was that. Maybe the fact that Americans had been an enemy for 2 decades or so, whereas the Chinese had been enemies for 2,000 years, and traditionally that the theming was more superficial in the case of Americans. Nonetheless, just like John Newton, this was somebody who was capable of still keeping a horrendous them, while another category of them, he was able to have a moral transformation. So the pieces move separately. Now, what this brings up in the face of like what individuals can accomplish, peace, rapprochement, forgiveness, all of that, cultures can do it as well. And we've already heard about some of those amazing examples, how Northern Ireland managed to become peaceful, other ones that seem totally improbable, the role of sacred symbols in the process, all of that. So, these two prior combating cultures have now figured out how to get along with each other. And what comes in at this point is back to that sort of point from a few days ago, the importance of sacred symbols, all of that, forgiveness, that there is an asymmetry to it. There's an asymmetry of what should be expected. Who was the oppressed in that relationship? Who was the unprovoked aggressor? Who dominated in the aftermath or in any assessment of what went on? There's an asymmetry built into there forever after. For example, in the aftermath of South Africa gaining its freedom from the apartheid regime there was some mention, some like counter snide, whatever, focusing on the fact that a number of atrocities were carried out by freedom fighters, members of the ANC, the African National Committee, that Congress, that they, in some cases, committed atrocities against Afrikaans civilians. And much was made in the aftermath in the West that was still kind of not sure if they liked the idea of this, that, you know what, there were bad people on both sides. You know what? Both sides committed atrocities. There was an attempt at trying to make them equivalent, and they could not possibly be equivalent. Just to give a sense, okay, apartheid for decades and decades before, if you were in the subordinated them group, your streets were filled with police and soldiers with guns of the thems. You were not allowed to go to certain places, checkpoints. If you were working in the them area, the dominant culture's area, you went through frisking every day and arbitrary harassment. You were given identity cards of different classes indicating which areas you could go into and which not. Then you look at the violence. over the course of violence, yes, there were atrocities by some of the fighters on the South African side, and the wonder of Mandela with his reconciliation commissions was that he insisted that those people be brought to justice, but it was the numbers. And I don't know, maybe I'm just pulling numbers out of a hat here, or maybe I'm thinking of some other arena of violence. If the freedom fighters from South Africa killed 1,000 civilians among the white majority killed 34, 35,000, and probably 17,000 of them were children. Again, I think that's what it was, but this may apply to another conflict. Moreover, what did the dominant culture do there? It blocked supplies going into the areas of rebels. It cut off water. It cut off electricity. It attacked aid convoys from the UN. It allowed a messianic extremist militant group of vigilantes among them to be armed and to look the other way when they were, just tragically taking supposed justice into their own hands, facilitating it, all of that going on, and all along rationalizing the domination with messianic notions of God is on our side and this is what was meant to be. And you look at that, and you look at the aftermath, and you look at the government that had the power and the bombs being handed weapons by the West, by Western corporations refusing to divest and making those governments, that apartheid government, wealthy and all of that because they were very resistant to divesting. Look at all of that, and as you assess something like that in a historical context, there is nothing resembling moral equivalency there. There's nothing that could be cited at all. You can feel empathy for the circumstances that brought about one of those people being someone who would commit atrocities, and perhaps you can feel empathy for the innocent victims from the side of the oppressors, but there should be no obligation to do so, and that should not be a watermark of one's humanity, because this works asymmetrically. Okay. So this brings us back to the notion of tragedy of the commons. And Josh Green, who we have heard so much about over the course of various topics here, Josh Green had a very interesting observation. He said, the tragedy of the commons is about in-group members. All the shepherds in this village, everyone who had sheep, everyone who is sharing a water source and not taking more than their share. What tragedy of the commons is about in-group problems, and what it's about is me versus us. Do I act selfishly against our collective us interests? In contrast are the circumstances where it's us versus them, and he termed this, instead of the tragedy of the commons, the tragedy of common sense thinking, built around a very critical notion, which is both groups. This is not you and the neighbor having your sheep hog the food or whatever, the grass. This is another group comes in, and now they want to use that land for farming, and you want to use it for herding, and it's you versus them on a very large level. And what Green identifies is the single most damaging thing that comes into tensions like that is when anyone on either side begins to cite the notion that it is their right to do something. Because as soon as somebody is saying it is their right, they are running there on their limbic system rather than their cortex. What they've just done is said, there is something I cannot justify, I cannot give a rationale for, that would make sense to anyone outside of our own particular biases, mores, history, prejudices, and so on, and I cannot explain why this should be the case beyond citing it as a right. And the problem with tragedies of common sense differences is both groups believe that they are in the right and they have their rights and they are mutually incompatible. Now, what came out of that is really interesting work that he then did, looking at sort of when you evoke people being more pro-social in the context of a tragedy of the commons, and when you make them more pro-social in the context of tragedy of common sense. Two mutually incompatible views as to what counts as justice, as to what counts as sacred, as to what, and there is no resolution there that is possible as long as the sides are saying, it is my right. I can't tell you why. It is my right. And what he showed in a really interesting experiment as follows. You take somebody in an economic game and they believe they are playing against an us, a fellow member of their tribe. And what he shows is the faster someone is forced to make a decision whether or not to cooperate or cheat, whether to be a nice guy or a jerk, all of that, the faster you force them to make a decision, the more likely they are to come up with a pro-social one. When you are running on automatic and it is an us, the implicit thing is to be nice, to be cooperative. In contrast, when people believe they were playing against a them, the faster you force them to give a response, the more likely they were to do something jerky and backstabbing. In other words, when we run on implicit, there's implicit bias against, hostility towards, discounting the needs of, decreased capacity of empathy for the thems. And out of that, he showed, comes a really important sort of prescription. When you want people to be nice to their us's, if it's a me versus an us issue, automatic fast responses tend to be pro-social. When people have more time, they can decide why it's not really their problem and somebody else will take care of it. And you know what? That person hasn't really been one of us. You have time to rationalize away your first instinct of being pro-social. And when you're trying to get people to be pro-social and making decisions of cooperation rather than cheating with them, the longer time they have to decide, the more likely that is to be the outcome, because the first reflex is antisocial. Longer time to do the very costly prefrontal cortical task of thinking about the world from their perspective and trying to understand how they got there. Rapid fire decisions about thems tend towards the hostile. Rapid fire decisions about us's tend to be pro-social. And I think out of that comes an incredibly important sort of set of guidelines. Now, what this all leads us to ultimately, as soon as we have Japanese individuals apologizing to a group of American survivors, we are looking at versions of neo-group selection. As soon as we have nations, as soon as we have religions, ethnicity, we have moved into our world of neo-group selection. And what you see is sort of focusing on that can produce some very bad things. All sorts of cases where increasing in-group cooperation causes a compensatory increase in out-group hostilities. That's the male chimps in the same group sitting there and them doing all these affiliative gestures with each other and getting everybody all emotionally contagious to go do a border patrol and kill a male from another group. One of the worst outcomes is when there is a compensatory thing so that making one side of the equation better guarantees the other side gets worse. Okay, within that though, there are cases where group selection has shown people recategorizing in dramatic ways as to which group they believe they belong to. And the famous moving example of that was the first Christmas of World War I, the World War I Christmas truce, December 1914, trenches in France and predominantly German soldiers facing off against British soldiers because the French had already surrendered. And in the trenches there, and the powers that be, heads of states, the Pope put in his 2 cents, declared that there would be a ceasefire Christmas evening. So everyone can have Christmas dinner, to go and collect their dead from no man's land in between the trenches, and that was decreed. This is a top-down decree. Heads of governments, popes, all of that, agreeing we are going to have a truce for that evening. So along came that evening, that December 1914, and people stopped firing at each other. And after a while, they worked up the nerve to come out of the trenches, to go into no man's land to retrieve their dead. And after a while, when they were trying to drag somebody back, somebody from the other side would help them carry the person. And then after a while, they were sharing dinner together in no man's land. And after a while, they were praying together and exchanging gifts and all of that. And the most remarkable thing about the Christmas truce was, and the next day, they refused to go back to fighting. They exchanged weapons as souvenirs. They exchanged medals, things of that sort. They took down each other's addresses so they could visit each other when the war was over. They played soccer. This is being like something that was documented, photos of it, where nobody kept score. These people who 2 days before were trying to kill each other were playing a game of soccer and exchanging Christmas gifts. And in lots of areas of the trenches, it went on for a second day and a third day, and eventually the officers, the powers that be, had to show up and say, unless you get back to running a war here, we are going to shoot you. That's what broke up the Christmas truce. And what was going on there was a switch of categories. Who is an us? An us is all of us poor bastards stuck in the trenches. Those trenches were these ones, where what's the enemy? The cold, the freezing rain, our food that's rotten, the rodents that eat through our food, the lice, all of that, the damn officers who show up and toss us out to be killed for their professional advancement and such. They all formed a common enemy at that point, and they all formed thus a completely new category of an us. And that went on for days and days until they went back to trying to kill each other. And what I've always been struck by is this happened up and down the hundreds of miles of the trenches there in France. If there was one invention that existed then that we have now, if people had cell phones, if you could have called up your buddy who was in the front 20 miles north and said, you know what, none of us have gone back to fighting here, and they would say, us too, and up and down the trenches. And if people knew that they were not an isolated pocket refusing to go back to war, if instead they found out that this was the case up and down the lines, that damn war would have stopped that day. And everyone would have put down their arms, or they would have held on to their arms and gone back home and gone after the people who really were responsible, starting the war. And if they had been able to get a mass movement there, something would have emerged. What would have emerged is the end of World War I in Western Europe, if only they could have communicated. But nonetheless, what was going on for those 2-3 days afterward, where it was every one of those soldiers had a different category in their head than usual as to who was an us and who was the them. There were all sorts of truces that came up along the trench lines that didn't happen because the Pope decreed it, that were bottom up, that emerged spontaneously. So, how do you spontaneously form a truce with the guys 100 yards away where all of you have been spending every day trying to kill each other? Here's what would be done. And this has been documented by this Axelrod, wrote a book called The Evolution of Cooperation, where he had a chapter on these spontaneous truces during World War I. Look at what they did. You bring up your best gunner, and they lob a shell over to the other side, not into the trenches, but blow up like an outhouse 20 yards behind the front line. Okay? Then have them do it again, and again, and again, and land shell after shell on that outhouse. And what are you telling the other side? Our guy is so good that he could have been landing it on your heads just now, and we chose not to do that. What are you going to do about it? And then the other side would get their best gunner and shoot and blow up the tree behind there over and over and over. And what they have just worked out was a truce between each other without an exchange of words, without speaking the same language in most cases. And what emerged after that was troops shot over each other's heads. They did that regularly. Casualties went way down because they were quietly refusing to shoot each other. And what they worked out were signals for when their officers showed up. Sorry, we got to actually shoot at you for a while. The damn colonel is here, and had to reestablish the truce as soon as that officer left. They evolved a tit for tat strategy. You'd have some new rookie on your side who didn't know how things worked and landed a shell down in the middle of their trench, and somebody from your side would hold up a white flag, stand on the edge and say, "Very sorry about that. We've got this new kid here who screwed up. Yeah, we filled him in." And tit for tat, what would be done then is they could launch one shell into your trenches, and each one of those would kill 3 or 4 men, and then the truce was reestablished. And they did this over and over again, up and down the trenches, until the military brass on both sides realized this was happening and began to transfer troops up and down the line. Because that broke up the prerequisite for beginning to change the us-theming there. Every morning you hear one of them singing this folk song while they're shaving. Every day they're like caricaturishly singing one of your military songs, and like you after a while sing back, and you're beginning to get a sense of them as individuals in there. And the second that happened, over and over again, there were the means to generate these spontaneous truces. So this brings us to the end of our aggression and antidotes to aggression material. And amazingly, back in the past, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, giving this class, this lasted for 2 lectures. And somehow each time it keeps getting longer and longer. And I kind of know why that's the case, that this keeps getting longer. And this has something to do with what I experienced a long time ago, shortly after college. I was in East Africa. I was spending a year there getting my baboon research started in Kenya. And next door, a war broke out between Uganda and Tanzania. Uganda at the time was ruled by one of the dictators of all time before your time, but nonetheless, maybe lots of you have heard of him, Idi Amin. Idi Amin had seized power in Uganda violently, and he was irresistible to the West because he was a buffoon. He had British businessmen carry him around in a sedan chair, or else he would shoot them. He wrote love letters to Queen Victoria, inviting her to be his 6th wife or whatever. He declared himself the King of Scotland. He had done some of his military training in Scotland and came back for a fondness for this. And for long periods in court, every time he came in, they'd play bagpipes and he had soldiers wearing kilts. And oh my God, he was a buffoon. The West couldn't get enough of this guy. And at the same time, he was killing tens of thousands of Ugandans that were not of his tribe. He was destroying the economy by pocketing it. And as both bragged about by him and is documented on some occasions, he ate the flesh of his enemies he had killed. And he eventually made a mistake. He decided he was going to invade Tanzania and take over some of the land. And Tanzania's army counterattacked and rolled over the Ugandan army, which any member of there who was not of his tribe didn't want to be there. And the army collapsed. And over the course of a few weeks, the Tanzanian army came up west of Lake Victoria and swept over the top to the capital, Kampala, at which point Idi Amin fled the country to Libya, which welcomed him. And Uganda had been liberated from him. And they pushed a little bit further east, and opened up a corridor from the capital to the border with Kenya. The day after they reached that point and opened up the border, I hitchhiked into Uganda. I was near the end of my year's work. I was at a point where I could take a few weeks off. I wanted to see this. People were dancing in the streets. When do you get to see this? I wanted to go to Kampala and look at people celebrating this. For years, I'd been hanging out with Quakers and trying to make sense of, is there ever such a thing as a just war? And if any seemed to fit that description, this one was it. So I wanted to see what it was. That's not why I wanted to go to Uganda. I wanted to go because, like, it was exciting and it would be cool stuff to see. And up until recently, before that, someone had been staying with me and she had left. So I was having all sorts of neurotransmitter issues there, being upset about that. I was being like a 20-year-old subadult primate and I wanted to go see a war. So I hitchhiked into there and I got to see terrifying things and heard things blow up, and it was appropriately scary and stories to tell forever after. And finally, it became too much, and I realized I'm scared and I want to get out of here. And I wanted to hitchhike back to Kenya in safety as soon as possible, which I started to do. But one last thing I wanted to do before leaving Uganda. Ever since I was a kid, I've been reading about the explorers of Africa and the attempts to find the source of the Nile, and which British explorer was going to discover the source of the Nile the same way that Columbus discovered America. But I was fascinated with that stuff, and part of my being really taken with that part of the world, and I wanted to go see where the Nile began. This one spot where a waterfall pouring out of Lake Victoria began the Nile. And this was by a town called Jinja near the Kenyan border. And I hitchhiked over to there to look at the source of the Nile. And there was a bridge across, which was on top of some hydroelectric plant or something as the water was flushing through. And I came over there and looked over the side and saw that at some point a soldier from one of the armies, and I couldn't tell anymore which, had been walked down the staircase there, down to a panel on the side of the dam there, with his hands tied behind his back, and a noose was tied around his neck and tied to the panel. And as the water levels would rise and come down, he would be knocked off his feet until he strangled, until he was now a bloated corpse lying there on the surface of the starts of the Nile. And I couldn't take my eyes off him. I thought this was the most fascinating. I wanted to see every possible detail. I wanted to go down and look closer. I wanted to get the hell out of there. I wanted to remember every bit of it. I wanted to forget every bit of it. I thought, good for you if you were one of our mean soldiers. This is what you deserved. But then I would think maybe you were forced to conscript. And then I would think, well, I know what I think about soldiers just taking orders. And I stood there frozen for hours, mesmerized looking at this body, at this corpse, until a Tanzanian soldier came along and chased me away and I left. And I realize 45 years later why these lectures keep getting longer and longer, because of that man. And because I wanted to go get a better look and I wanted to run away. And this was exciting and this was horrifying, and we are back to where we started with this. As we'll see, depression, uniformly bad news. Schizophrenia, uniformly bad news. Childhood cancer, Alzheimer's disease, uniformly bad. But aggression is different, because the same behaviors, the same fixed action patterns, the same limbic activation in one context is the most heroic thing on earth, and in another the most horrifying. And it's for that reason, the fact that when it's the right kind of aggression, we want to jump up and participate and are excited and our hearts race, while we are horrified when it's the other version. It's for that reason that aggression is always going to be the hardest of these topics to understand. And thus, it's the one that we have to study the most.